Alexander Litvinenko, former colonel in the KGB, a central figure in London's Russian émigré community and enemy number one, some say, for Putin's Russia through his links with the Chechen cause. He spoke as he lay dying in a London hospital.
На меня вышел человек, предложил мне встретиться. Встреча состоялась 1 числа в одном из ресторанов города Лондона. Он мне передал бумаги, вот все. После этой встречи, через несколько часов, я уже все был в состоянии отравления.
What wasn't known then was that he'd been poisoned with radioactive polonium-210. He was buried a week ago, but Litvinenko lingered longer than his killers might have expected, and the trail of polonium meant a chance to find them. So who did kill Litvinenko and why? There are plenty of theories out there, but from a London perspective at least, 3 leading contenders. In no particular order, we have first Putin himself, or Putin's friends, elements of Russia's secret service, now known as the FSB.
It's clear now that this order was given by the FSB. I think it is still questionable whether President Putin knew about this order in advance or not. Probably not.
Then there's the Siloviki, literally the men of force, meaning the security services plus powerful figures in the defence and foreign ministries, already vying for power in the run-up to presidential elections in 2008.
You need a group of people with some knowledge in order to put the whole package together, and that might indicate state involvement. It might just indicate a very elaborate mafia involvement, for instance.
And finally, Putin's business enemies, the fabulously wealthy oligarchs, both at home and those abroad, notably Boris Berezovsky and his close circle of friends.
Kremlin-linked or Kremlin-controlled media, or even relatively free media, tends to be pointing the finger at Russia's enemies abroad.
So let's take a forensic step into these worlds. First, who are the key players? Alexander Litvinenko, former KGB colonel, most recently a would-be broker of business deals between Europe and Russia, sometime journalist and anti-Putin agitator. Then there are the Russians he met in London this autumn, now of interest to the police. 2 were childhood friends of his, and like him, former KGB. Andrei Lugovoy had business links to Litvinenko, but his allegiances are unclear, and Dmitry Kovtun, polonium-210 has been found in a flat he used in Hamburg. And then there's Vyacheslav Sokolenko, the so-called third man. Litvinenko knew him less well, and Newsnight understands he was suspicious of him. Then there's Boris Berezovsky, the wealthy exile granted asylum here after Litvinenko exposed a plot in Russia to kill him. Some argue Berezovsky might need to refresh the claim his life's at risk, though Litvinenko was a close associate. Finally, Vladimir Putin, seen in Europe as presiding over an increasingly autocratic regime in Russia, with the critical lever of energy supply at his disposal. We went back to the heart of Mayfair to retrace the polonium trail. How did it get here? Radiation's been picked up on aircraft travelling into London from Moscow. Nick Priest worked at the UK's Atomic Energy Authority and has vast experience of Russia's nuclear programme. He says a Russian source fits with the fact that Russia's reactors produce more polonium than anywhere else.
There are some sites which are more likely than others. When these produce large amounts of polonium-210 for the market, and it's quite possible for somebody to what we call dip a source, because the amount which they were taking is very small compared with the amount produced. It could almost be taken surreptitiously without people even realising it.
Nuclear officials in Russia, of course, say that's impossible. It seems likely, though, that any of our 3 suspect groups are powerful enough to engineer access to a source of polonium. So what does the route of the polonium trail itself tell us? Britain's polonium trail zigzags across the heart of London's Mayfair. Throughout September, Andrei Lugovoy and Alexander Litvinenko were meeting, both have claimed, to sort out business deals. Litvinenko said he was advising European companies on how best to do business with Russia. On October the 12th, Lugovoy is spotted walking down Piccadilly. Then on the 16th, both Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun fly from Moscow to London on the start-up Russian Transaero airline. Their plane, number EIDDK, is still being sought by UK investigators for radiation testing. That night, October the 16th, Lugovoy and Kovtun stay in the Parks Hotel in Knightsbridge. Surfaces in a bedroom later test positive, including a door handle. Now this places the polonium in the UK in mid-October, a full 2 weeks before Mr. Litvinenko is thought to have been poisoned. It's also been suggested to me that a briefcase became contaminated here, and that this then travelled with the men on the British Airways planes, explaining why they tested positive. For example, we understand an overhead locker on one of those planes was radioactive. On October the 16th and 17th, Lugovoy, Kovtun and Litvinenko reportedly eat at the Itsu sushi bar and visit the offices of private security company Erinis in Grosvenor Street. It specialises in protection for the oil and gas industry. They also visit number 1 Cavendish Place, just north of Mayfair, and both premises have tested positive. Intriguingly, this is the office of Risk Solutions. Before a name change, this company was run by Stephen Curtis, an international lawyer who died in a controversial helicopter crash in 2004. He was connected with the Yukos Oil Company, effectively running it after its owner, the oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was jailed in Siberia on tax evasion charges. On October the 25th, Lugovoy flies in on the first British Airways plane to be contaminated. Investigators suspect that this could be the second time the poloniums arrived in the UK, possibly on the contaminated briefcase. He stays here at the Sheraton Park Lane Hotel, and Newsnight's been told that room 848 here has radiation levels as high as those found at the Millennium Hotel less than a mile away, and that everyone who's stayed in that room here since October the 26th is now being contacted for checks on their radiation levels. On October the 28th, Lugovoy flies back to Moscow from London on that same British Airways plane. But more intriguingly, around this time, the Kovtun polonium trail is picked up in Hamburg. He arrives in the German city from Moscow on an Aeroflot jet, which German authorities want to test. Radiation's found in his BMW car, strangely involved in some kind of accident, after Kovtun arrives, though not reported to the police. His contamination suggests he's been exposed even before reaching the city, and the Germans say they're investigating him for importing radioactive material. On October the 31st, Lugovoy and Kovtun made their final visit to London. Lugovoy flew in on a British Airways plane, which later tested positive. They both stayed here at the Millennium Hotel. This was the night before the fatal poisoning. That same night, October the 31st, in what could prove to be an important piece in this puzzle, we've been told Mr. Lugovoy came here to the offices of the oligarch Boris Berezovsky. The two men apparently shared a few glasses of wine. Mr. Lugovoy was still providing security services for some members of Berezovsky's family. And we've been told that 2 chairs where Mr. Lugovoy sat that night have later tested positive. What's not clear is why he came here and just how close the two men's business links really are. On the morning of November the 1st, police say Litvinenko's bus ticket tested negative, strongly suggesting that this was the day of his first exposure to polonium. Police believe Litvinenko's fatal poisoning took place in Mayfair's Millennium Hotel, in a bar still closed to the public. On November the 1st, Litvinenko meets Lugovoy and Kovtun here in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel. The third man, Vyacheslav Sokolenko, and possibly 2 other Russians are also present. Lugovoy's wife and children are said to be nearby, and Lugovoy even claims his 8-year-old son comes up to his and Litvinenko's table. Newsnight understands that hotel rooms 441 and 101 are of particular interest to the police, with significant levels of radiation in both, and that the polonium is most likely to have been put into Mr. Litvinenko's tea. That tea is now thought to have spread radiation to 7 bar staff, probably as they handled crockery and a contaminated cloth. Later that same day, Litvinenko meets Mario Scaramella in the Itsu sushi bar. Scaramella is later found to be slightly contaminated, but is now considered unlikely to have been involved in the poisoning itself. That evening, Mr. Litvinenko visits Berezovsky's Mayfair office to photocopy documents from Scaramella, warning that both his and Litvinenko's lives are at risk. In the evening, Lugovoy, Kovtun and the third man, Sokolenko, say they headed off for the Arsenal-Moscow CSKA Champions League match. Sokolenko swears the match is the reason for his trip to the UK, but it's been suggested to us that the men didn't even have tickets for the game when they arrived in London. All 3 men deny involvement in Litvinenko's murder. Lugovoy and Kovtun claim they've been exposed to polonium. So who might have a motive to see Litvinenko poisoned? His associates say Putin, or those close to him. Yuri Felshtinsky is the exiled co-author with Mr. Litvinenko of a book that famously accused Putin of blowing up apartment blocks in Moscow to gain public sympathy for a second war on Chechnya. He thinks if Lugovoy was involved, he might merely have been a cover, not necessarily aware of the nature of the poison.
It's of course understandable that Lugovoy knows that Litvinenko is going to be poisoned, but I'm sure that Lugovoy would not ask, oh, by the way, how are you going to poison him? What kind of poisoning are you going to use? He's a military man, he was working for the FSB for many years. I'm sure that he would not ask extra questions, because the general rule is that the less you know, the better is for you.
What this doesn't explain is why Putin or his friends would risk the PR damage if the plan were uncovered. And in any case, Litvinenko's row with Putin over Chechnya is an old one. But what if the polonium was discovered only by chance? There was no message in that choice of poison, just a nasty way to kill someone who's betrayed you.
The kind of counter-arguments that have been made that Litvinenko didn't have any current threat value to the Kremlin don't really apply. It's sufficient justification to have left and to be criticising Russia from abroad. So you have a kind of corporate motive within the security services for hunting down, as they see it, a traitor.
And how about the powerful Siloviki, the parallel establishment in Russia? It's been suggested that the Siloviki may have suspected, wrongly, that Litvinenko knew more about them and their power base than he actually did, that he had a report on Yukos, or a British company, that worried Russia's secret service and made him vulnerable. None of this explains Lugovoy, Kovtun or Sokolenko's roles in this death, if indeed they had one, or who exactly they might have been working for. And in seeking motives to poison Litvinenko, some argue that Berezovsky has the most to gain from seeing Putin's reputation tarnished. So how might a theory involving Putin's enemies work?
Some kind of framing of the Kremlin. This is the line in Moscow, probably as you would expect, that Kremlin-linked or Kremlin-controlled media, or even relatively free media, tends to be pointing the finger at Russia's enemies abroad.
In the end, Mayfair's polonium trail itself could be the undoing of the killer, and Litvinenko's business meetings in Mayfair are key. There are persistent rumours that Lugovoy is about to spill the beans, naming the British companies and the deals that he and Litvinenko were discussing. Litvinenko's life was about confusion and disinformation. In death, it seems, little has changed.